This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, I guess I should say. This is Greg Johnson, CWCB. We are going to give it just another few minutes here to let folks jump on the line, and then we'll get started. All right, everyone, I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. Certainly, folks can keep joining. This is Greg Johnson with Colorado Water Conservation Board. I am going to hand things over to Matt Lindberg today, and then we've got other members from our tech team that Matt will introduce to really walk through this tech webinar and kind of some of the tools that we're excited to have developed for the technical update to the water plan that is coming out in less than a month on the 18th of July at our board meeting. We're going to release the study. So very excited about that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Matt Lindberg with Brown & Caldwell, who's been the project manager, doing a wonderful job with this whole study.
Okay, great. Thanks, Greg. Maybe we'll turn our attention really quick to our agenda today. We're going to start off, and I'll do this talking a little bit about the background, some of the goals for the technical update, an overview of our methodology, and a discussion of what the gap analysis look like in the future. And then we'll turn it over to Brendan Heddle from Jacobs, who's going to talk about some studies that were done that are going to provide some interesting insights to basin roundtables as they update their basin implementation plan, their plans. And then I'll turn it over to Becky Donovan from CDM Smith. She's going to give an overview of some tools that we have developed on the environmental and recreational side, and also on the project costing side to provide some assistance to basin roundtables. And then Russ Sands and Greg Johnson are going to wrap us up and talk about some of the next steps and what do we do with all this good information that has been developed through the technical update. And so a few words about our overall methodology. So this is going to be the first update that's been done since the publication of Colorado's water plan. And so it's going to be done through the context of a three-pronged approach to water planning. And you'll hear more about this later in the presentation. But the previous SWASs, you'll probably remember, included components that focused on technical analyses, implementation recommendations, such as portfolios of projects that can be used to fill future gaps, and then also policy considerations. And these three components are being split as we go forward, all being conducted, though, under the umbrella of Colorado's water plan. So, for example, development of projects for filling the gap is really going to be done under basin implementation plans. That's what was done when those basin implementation plans were first developed. In the update to basin implementation plans, which is kicked off already with some preliminary discussions, but will continue in earnest once the technical update is finished, those basin implementation plans will really be where we consider projects. Then policy considerations, funding considerations, those sorts of things are included in the water plan proper. And so the technical update really focuses on data sets and tools that are going to be useful for basin roundtables when they update their BIPs. One of the biggest challenges in conducting the technical update was the incorporation of scenario planning, and we have a couple of fact sheets that have been developed that just should have popped up on your screen. You can find these fact sheets and other fact sheets on the water plan website, and they provide a high-level description of the methodologies that we use to conduct various parts of the study. I'll call your attention to the scenario planning and gap analysis methodology fact sheet and that little diagram in the bottom center of your screen. We call that the cone of uncertainty, and it really sort of describes the concept behind scenario planning. So on the left, you see 2018, and that's representative of current conditions. And then on the right side of that cone, you see these divergent future scenarios designated as A through E. And those are future plausible scenarios that would occur in 2050 based on a number of different drivers that impact water supplies and water demands. And each one of those drivers have uncertainty associated with them. And so scenario planning looks at those drivers, looks at those uncertainties, and sort of embraces this uncertainty about the future and makes plans to address all of those future scenarios, even though in the future we may end up and will very likely end up in a mix of those future scenarios. So another, actually a very important driver and another addition to this version of the technical update is that of climate change. We are incorporating different assumptions about what our climate will look like in the future, and those are described in the table in the bottom right corner of your screen. The 5 different planning scenarios are listed, and then on the right side of that table, it lists what our assumptions are regarding our future climate conditions. So under the business as usual and weak economy scenarios, we're assuming that our future climate is going to be pretty similar to what we see today. Under the adaptive innovation and hot growth scenarios, we're assuming that we're going to have a very hot and a very dry future climate. So it's a more extreme condition. And then we have an aptly named in-between climate scenario that assumes our climate's going to be somewhere between what we've seen in the past and this hotter and drier situation. And so in order to incorporate all this complexity of the 5 different scenarios of climate change and a number of other new additions to the technical update, we've really relied on the modeling tools that have been developed through Colorado's decision support system. They have allowed us to incorporate all of this complexity and efficiently evaluate how our future supplies and demands and gaps may look like under each of these different scenarios. And so I'll spend a couple minutes now talking about the overall goals of the technical update. One is really to devise and develop a consistent statewide framework that all the basin roundtables can use in updating their basin implementation plans, and so that all of this seamlessly flows up into Colorado's water plan. Another goal is to develop tools and data for the roundtables to use. We're going to have just a lot of information and some very valuable tools for them to utilize when they update their basin implementation plans. And then Colorado's water plan had a number of goals and actions that pertain to the technical update. One is to set up a framework for monitoring the drivers of future change so that we can identify which one of those scenarios that we're moving towards or how those scenarios are combined. We're also, as we've discussed, promoting scenario planning and adaptive strategies, and really relying on Colorado's decision support system to do a lot of these analyses. So the gap is going to look a little bit different than what you're familiar with. In the lower left side of your screen is what we call the wedge diagram, and it shows our existing supplies, yields from identified projects and processes, and gives you a depiction of what the gap may look like in 2050. This was done for low, medium, and high gaps based on a few drivers, but the new version of the technical update is going to include a more broad set of drivers and some robust analyses and results. And that's not to say that the prior evaluation of the gap was at all faulty. It was a great analysis and really made a lot of good use of the data we had available to us at the time, but we have new data sets now, and we have some new modeling tools or newly available modeling tools that we're able to apply to these 5 different scenarios. So you can see in the lower right-hand corner of your screen the 5 different scenarios, and underneath each one of those scenarios, 5 of the important drivers that are going to affect our future and how those change with each of the scenarios and how they sort of relate to one another within each scenario. And that's a depiction of the narratives that describe these scenarios in Colorado's water plan. Each one of these scenarios was described in the water plan as sort of a story. And one of the big challenges of the technical update was to take that story, to take that narrative, and turn that into something that's quantifiable so that we can put numbers to this. So it was really sort of turning narrative into numbers. And we had technical advisory groups that helped us do that early on in the project, and that was a very valuable exercise to get input from folks from different roundtables across the state with expertise in the various areas of study to help us develop these new methodologies that we needed to use to adequately evaluate these different scenarios. So in the process of doing our evaluation, we did all kinds of different modeling, hydrologic, modeled municipal water demands, ag demands. We've developed some tools for environmental and rec that we'll hear about from Becky that use that modeling output. And so as a result, we're going to have a very, as I mentioned before, robust set of output data that not only allows us to compare conditions across the scenarios, but also gives us the opportunity to look within a scenario and see how things change, how demands change, how gaps change in response to wet, dry, average conditions within each one of those scenarios. So really good stuff. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brendan, who's going to talk about some of the studies that are going to provide some good insights to Basin Roundtables.
And real quick logistical note, we do have the chat feature live, so feel free to pipe in with questions using the GoToMeeting chat feature. And also, just forgot to mention that we are recording all of these, so we really see these as being a resource moving forward. And to that end, we've got all the other ones that we've done to date posted on the water plan website. So feel free to use those. And this one will then be posted hopefully later today for your reference. Great. Thanks, Brendan.
All right. Thanks, Greg. My name is Brendan Huddle. I'm a water resources engineer at Jacobs Engineering. And we're going to go over a couple of side studies that were done to complement the rest of the technical update data that Matt was just mentioning a few minutes ago. And really, these are a series of studies on a diverse range of topics that are designed to provide some context into what it may mean to consider options to solve the future supply and demand gap. So just kind of a real high-level overview of what I'm going to talk to you about. We're going to start with a study that was done on public values to really set the stage of the current public understanding of water issues in Colorado. Then we're going to move to a study that will look at the economic impacts of future shortages to provide context into what it may mean to not solve the future gap and kind of frame out that issue. Then the next three studies that deal with storage opportunities, water reuse opportunities, and alternative transfer methods are really designed to provide some context into what it may mean to address the future gap and frame out how those opportunities fit into larger portfolios of options that can be considered. So with that, let's move to the next slide. We'll start with public values. So this, as you'll see, we have kind of a common format to talking about these side studies. We're going to start with a question, go through our high-level analysis, and then end with some of the key insights that we identified from each study. So in this one, we asked the question, can we better understand public values related to water supply challenges in Colorado? And to go about this, the team really looked to update a 2013 survey that was conducted by CWCB and BBC Research and Consulting that looked at the public's awareness of water issues in the state. This survey in 2013 surveyed about 2,000 residents throughout the state and asked them a series of questions to gauge their awareness on a wide variety of issues. An example question here is below, or two questions actually, are below on the screen. You can see questions were asked about, is the public aware Colorado has enough water to meet current needs and future needs? And as you can see, results indicate that a majority of people were aware that Colorado has current and future water supply challenges. Next slide. Summarizing some of the key insights that were gained from this study, kind of break it into three categories. The first one is the top three public concerns that were identified. So on the top left of your screen, you can see these top three public concerns. First one, interestingly, had to do with the quality of water that people had in their homes. Almost a quarter of survey respondents listed this as their top concern. Closely behind in spots number 2 and 3 were basically water supply for agriculture and municipal uses. Interesting to me, this was before the 2015 Flint water crisis, which shows that, water quality is at the top of the public's awareness of water issues in Colorado. But also it indicates maybe the public might not know the magnitude of water supply challenges in the future. Kind of going down to the bottom, when asked about top three public solutions, survey respondents indicated conservation as their number one way to address water supply challenges, followed basically equally by prioritizing environmental needs and basically developing new infrastructure, whether or not that's pipelines, dams, reservoirs, to help solve the gap. This all kind of plays into the third point here on the right, willingness to pay. So survey respondents were asked what would they be willing to pay and contribute to help solve the gap in the future at a hypothetical level. As you can see from this plot, it's a little bit small, but I'll kind of summarize the highlights here. Around 70% of the population, regardless of their income level, would be willing to pay about $1 more per month to help solve the gap, while only around 30% of the population would be willing to pay $25 more per month. So this is kind of interesting. It gives you a window into what we as water planners have to work with in the future as to what people might be willing to contribute to help solve future gaps. For perspective, there's around 1.7 million homes in Colorado. So at $20 a month of additional willingness to pay, that equates to about $400 million per year. So again, this is hypothetical and pretty large scale, but it gives you an idea into what people might be thinking and what they're aware of when it comes to implementing solutions in future. So our next side study deals with economic impacts of shortages. So building off of kind of public awareness, we asked the question, what are the potential economic impacts of failing to solve future supply and demand gaps in Colorado? And I just want to note that this was done contemplated at a very hypothetical high level. So we're not predicting the future, but we're trying to give some perspective as to, what's the worst case scenario if we don't solve the gaps? What are the economic implications for the state, both in terms of tax revenue, jobs, economic output, et cetera? So to think about this, I want to first note that BBC Research and Consulting did the heavy lifting on this analysis and really thought through this issue in some quite detail. To do that, they took projected gaps from SWASI 2010, as results were not available at the time we did this analysis for the technical update, Then we use conceptual economic modeling, basically of future conditions, to consider how jobs and economic outputs throughout the state in a couple of sectors, municipal and industrial and agricultural, were impacted. And to do this, these implications were broken into two categories. One, already incurred agricultural gaps, and then future 2050 municipal and industrial shortages due to basically the marginal cost of a portion of the future gaps and the opportunity costs of foregone future development. Next slide. So that was a lot right there, but basically kind of the high-level key insights that we identified in this study were kind of broken into existing and future shortage impacts. So under existing shortage impacts, we can see that under the worst case conditions, there's approximately $3 billion in annual revenue that would not be realized and 28,000 fewer jobs already incurred in the agricultural and ranching sector. Then in the future, when we consider additional shortages to the municipal and industrial sectors, that adds 53 to 90 billion in annual revenues not realized, maybe 335,000 to almost 600,000 fewer jobs, and 3 to 6 billion in annual state and local tax revenues that are not realized. And kind of putting those into a graphical sense, on the right, you can see a plot here of the proportions of projected 2050 economic impacts broken out by already incurred and future gaps by basin. And so this is a really interesting plot because you can see the breakout of basins that maybe have high proportions of agricultural economic output and are water short versus basins that have a lot of municipal and industrial output that have a higher percentage-wise of future economic implications to them. So really our point with this is that we wanted to provide some context to planners and what it means to do nothing. I'll note this is not a doomsday prediction, and we're not intending to show doomsday scenarios here, but rather we really wanted to frame out what is the value of water. And this gives some high-level perspective as to how water is valuable in our state, and really should provide some perspective on what it means to contemplate future solutions to make sure that even a portion of this doesn't happen in the future. So moving on, these next, as I mentioned before, these next three side studies have to do with opportunities to solve the future supply and demand gap. So this first one I'm going to start with is storage opportunities. So similarly, we'll start with the question, what opportunities exist for developing future storage and increasing existing storage in the state? Really, to go about this, we queried the state's water rights database, and we kind of looked for two things. One, we're going to identify currently decreed storage and future conditional storage projects that were in the water rights database. And we really were trying to get a perspective of what's the current level of storage in the state, and then what's identified, down the line, potentially. As you can see in this plot on the right, this is current storage in Colorado. We have about 7.5 million acre feet of storage. It's broken out by basin, and you can really see that generally storage uses are dominated by irrigation and municipal uses. Next slide. So moving on to some of our key insights here. As I mentioned, we queried conditional water rights to see what if people filed, what is in the official water rights database. And we noted that there's 6.5 million acre feet of conditional future new storage reservoirs above 5,000 acre feet in size. This kind of gives you some perspective as to where people are contemplating future storage projects and the magnitude. And 6.5 million acre feet is a lot. I think it's worth noting that 6.5 million acre feet of conditional storage rights, if constructed, would nearly double the existing surface water storage in Colorado. It's more than 15 times the Colorado Water Plan's measurable objective of 400,000 acre feet of additional storage by 2050. Now, I think we all know that 6.5 million acre feet of storage is not likely to be built by 2050, but even if only a portion of the conditional storage rights are ultimately determined to be technically and environmentally feasible, these new surface water facilities could become a critical component to a balanced approach of meeting projected water resources gaps throughout Colorado in the future. The next point I want to note that we looked at in this study on the right side of your screen, we contemplated a few other options beyond just surface storage as ways to gain additional storage in both new and existing facilities. As you can see, I'll just kind of note these. We looked at reallocation of flood storage to active water supply storage, removal of sediment from reservoirs, rehab of existing fill-restricted dams, dam enlargements, and aquifer storage and recovery. These are all options that could be used in conjunction with new surface storage to basically provide a broad portfolio of storage opportunities in the future. So just kind of in closing on this, it's often said that storage should be considered as a key part of the solution to solving future gaps. And this side study, we feel, really provides some context on how much conditional storage is available by basin, as well as opportunities for increasing storage without constructing new dams. So moving on, another opportunity we looked at concerns water reuse. So again, we asked the question, what are key considerations for developing future reuse projects? To do this, we looked at a variety of different types of reuse. We looked at reuse via exchange, indirect and direct potable reuse, non-potable reuse, and gray water reuse. And we tried to compare and contrast benefits, challenges, and key points to consider when basins or other planners are contemplating use of different types of reuse to help solve their own local supply and demand gaps in the future. And I think it's important to note we developed a pretty comprehensive documentation here on this subject and developed a series of fact sheets that really try to outline our thoughts on benefits, challenges, key regulatory items, and several other points that are important to consider. And we hope that this provides some useful perspective when people are reading this in the future. So some of our key insights we identified here, this is again at the highest level, but I think it's really important for people to consider all forms of reuse can reduce the need for new supplies. That's a key takeaway, and it doesn't matter what kind of reuse you are doing. There is a benefit in the form of reduced new supplies potentially. We also note some types of reuse can be more effective than others. For example, some types of reuse, such as direct and indirect, can reuse water year-round, which potentially meets a wider range of demands and further reduces the need for new supplies. We feel, similar to storage, this subject, it's often said that reuse can be considered as a key part of the solution of solving future gaps. We really want to provide some context that not all reuse mechanisms have equal benefits, and they're implemented in different ways. I think that can lead to this last point here, where reuse can result in a reduction in downstream flow, and we really recommend close consideration and coordination with downstream users when a reuse project is being contemplated in the future. Again, I'll note, last point on this, that we have a lot of documentation in the technical update that's going to be coming out that talks much more and explores these subjects in much greater detail. We have a series of hypothetical mass balances that walk through all these types of reuse to give readers some perspective as to the larger watershed impacts of different kinds of reuse. And we hope that this is helpful for people when doing planning in the future. Okay, our last side study here that's kind of an opportunity concerns alternative transfer methods. This, of course, is a topic that gets a lot of attention here in Colorado, and so we really weren't trying to rehash anything that's already been done, but try to frame this topic in terms of how it's an opportunity and a part of the solution in conjunction with some of the other things that I mentioned previously. So to that end, we asked the question, how might traditional barriers to alternative transfer methods be overcome in the future, and what scale would they be needed to make a large impact? Similar to reuse, we compared benefits and challenges of different kinds of ATMs. So in this side study, we looked at agricultural to municipal transfers, ag to environmental transfers, and agricultural to compact compliance transfers. These are all kinds of alternative transfer method programs that have been implemented in Colorado and could be part of a diverse, balanced portfolio moving forward into the future. So to that end, we identified a couple of key insights. On the left side of your screen here, we looked at several different recently implemented ATM programs and tried to characterize them and identify some common themes as to why they were successful, and identify some points that people can consider in the future when they're thinking about these programs. And really some of the common themes that we noted that came together in all these programs, they took advantage of new legal abilities to transfer water. For instance, in the last couple of years, there's been a wide range of legislation that is designed to make ATMs more feasible and easier to implement, such as the Agricultural Water Right Protection Act in 2016. In conjunction with new legislation, there's new legal mechanisms to protect historical consumptive use for sellers. There's innovative new operations like split season fallowing that parties are taking advantage of. And I think really the most important point we noted, there's no one size fits all solution for ATMs in Colorado. There's no common framework you can drop onto a couple of parties to make a program work. It really requires a lot of coordination and desire to find benefits for both sellers and buyers to make a successful ATM. The last point I want to mention here on the right side of your screen, we kind of did a little thought experiment. We were curious, what are the land impacts and land required to really make a large-scale alternative transfer method program be implemented? So we asked this hypothetical question, assuming in the South Platte Basin, there's a 100,000 acre-foot future gap, municipal and industrial gap. What would it take to implement an ATM program to meet just 25% of that gap? And we went through a series of high-level thought experiment calculations, and basically our answer is you might need 15% of South Platte Basin irrigated acres to be enrolled in a large-scale ATM program. That's about 825,000 acres. In addition to that, once you have the land, you need infrastructure to make an ATM program work. And so there are significant infrastructure components potentially required, maybe storage, pipelines, in conjunction with exchanges and pumps to make a program like this work. So again, we really wanted to try to frame out some issues that future planners can consider when they're looking at ATMs in the future. So with that, that was a lot of information. I realized I kind of glossed over several things, but I hope that you can take away that we were really trying to outline a bunch of things that are useful for people in the future. All of these studies are designed to provide statewide planning, basin roundtable planning, with key points to consider when evaluating opportunities to address the gap. And just to recap, the three opportunities we mentioned, storage, reuse, and ATMs, all demonstrate promise, but they also show that there are dynamic conditions to consider that require a full understanding of impacts to the watershed for each unique basin. And I think it's really important to note that these are all part of addressing the future supply and demand gaps, but each one on its own is not a silver bullet, and each one on its own is not easy. But we think that this really frames up these issues in a hopefully helpful manner, and I just want to note that more detail on all these topics is included in the detailed technical update documentation. We feel that all these concepts can be advanced by the Basin Roundtables in the future as they contemplate supply and demand gap solutions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Becky.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Becky Donovan with CDM. I will be talking about two tools that we've developed to help for future planning. We're going to start with the environmental flow tool, which was presented previously in an earlier webinar. So for those of you that did not attend that one, I am going to provide sort of a brief overview of the flow tool, but there is more detail in the previously recorded webinar and in the tech memo associated with the tool. And then we'll switch gears and talk about the cost estimating tool for water projects. And we haven't presented that one in a webinar yet, so we'll go through that in a little bit more detail. So starting with the environmental flow tool, the environmental flow tool was really designed to assess and compare flow conditions in each basin. The tool really builds off a legacy of stakeholder involvement and was developed with input from a technical advisory group. For those of you that have been involved all along, the flow tool incorporates components of the watershed flow evaluation tool and the historical stream flow analysis tool. And it can serve as a resource to help roundtables refine, categorize, and prioritize their current and future portfolio of ENR projects and methods. Really, it's just going to provide a better understanding of flow needs based on this new scenario planning outcomes and modeling. The flow tool uses hydrologic data from the DSS and the model flow projections for the 5 planning scenarios, along with established flow ecology relationships to assess risks to flows and macro attributes at 54 pre-selected gauges across the state. So this map shows the location of the gauges. Again, it's 54 pre-selected gauges. They were selected for inclusion based on a number of factors. Gauges were reviewed collaboratively with the Nature Conservancy, CWCB, and Wilson Water to determine available attribute data, so where key environmental and recreational attributes or resources were located and concentrated within a basin. So this map is showing the shading is where concentrations of these macro attribute categories are. And then we considered spatial coverage across the basin and also looked at data availability. So some sites that we selected initially were eliminated due to data gaps or an insufficient period of record. Along the bottom, we're showing the macro attribute categories that are used in the flow tool. So cold water fish, warm water fish, plains fish, wetlands and riparian species, and then boating and in-stream flows. So this busy slide shows a number of components that are available in the environmental flow tool. So it's an Excel-based tool. It estimates risks, again, to these ENR attributes under various hydrologic scenarios. We're using well-established flow ecology relationships. So the flow ecology metrics quantify the relationship between specific flow statistics, for example, the average magnitude of peak flows, the ratio of flow in August and September to the mean annual flow, and takes that information to quantify risks to the attributes. The Nature Conservancy helped us define the risk categories, low to very high, based on a percent departure for flows from a reference condition to the future scenario. So within the tool, you can see on the left-hand side is the user interface. Again, it's in Excel. You can select your basin, your node, your simulation period. There's a reference condition, which can be naturalized or baseline. I note here that although naturalized is often the condition referenced in environmental studies, baseline's included too because it represents existing condition and may provide a more realistic reference point, but they're both available. And then you can select a future condition. On the bottom left, it's showing all the different flow statistic outputs that are available. An example here is the mean monthly flow with the bar chart for all the different scenarios. And then the bottom, again, is this environmental flow chart, which shades categories by risk. The risk categories vary for each metric, and not all metrics are applicable at each node. So plains fish may, are not present in the higher regions. So basically, the takeaway for the flow tool is that it's certainly not prescriptive. It doesn't designate any gap values, nor does it provide the basis for any regulatory action. It's really showing ecological change based on stream flow. So it doesn't identify areas where any risks or changes may be associated with factors other than stream flow. Summary results from the tool are not interchangeable with site-specific analysis, but the flow tool is really intended for use by the basin roundtables to inform scenario planning and decision making using all the new data that's developed under the technical update. So that was a brief overview of the flow tool, and we'll change gears here and talk about the Colorado Water Project Cost Estimating Tool. It's a mouthful. So again, this is new, I think, as being presented in these webinars. It was developed out of a need to have plant-level project cost estimates for proposed projects. So during the last round of basin implementation plan development, the roundtables were tasked with identifying completed, ongoing, and proposed projects and methods for addressing water supply needs. All basins but one identified project cost as a key component. However, only 16% of projects throughout all the BIPs provided estimates for project costs. So this really demonstrated a need for an accessible costing tool for basins to use during the next round to determine potential funding needs. The information is also useful to CWCB for determining available funds through programs such as the Water Supply Reserve Fund. It is also an Excel-based tool. This slide here is showing the overview page. For ease of navigation, the tool components are presented on the page and provides links to all the project modules, and also gives some tool instructions and disclaimers. The cost estimating tool can be used to estimate high-level costs for a single project, a component of a larger project, and modules can be combined to estimate costs for a more complex project. So on the next slide, we'll just walk through some screenshots from the tool and talk about what it does. So moving on from the overview page, a user would likely navigate to the global inputs page, which is shown here. The tab collects general project information that's used for project development costs and for cost escalation for future projects. The tool, we've designed it to project future costs using a fixed 3.5% inflation rate, and this rate was based on long-term inflation trends provided by CWCB. On this slide too, I note up on the top left the input key, so this is sort of used throughout the tool. White and green cells are user input. White cells are needed for cost calculations, while green cell values are informational and do not influence project costs. The purpose of collecting the informational data is for tool improvement during future iterations. We certainly built this tool using the best information available, but as more projects are costed using this, or as more project costs are available, the tool can be refined. Blue cells are default values provided for the user, but they can be adjusted, so we recommend project data be thoroughly reviewed prior to adjusting those default values. Gray cells are calculated values. They are required for the costing, and they are locked to prevent user adjustment. Another busy slide, but the takeaway here is shows all the different modules that are available. There's 8. The tool can be used to cost water transmission pipeline projects for transporting raw or treated water supplies, well field projects for public water supply, irrigation, or ASR, new reservoir or reservoir expansion projects, water treatment projects, new ditches or ditch rehabilitation projects with or without a diversion structure, stream and habitat improvement or restoration projects, and user input. This table just shows that the amount of data needed from the user varies by project. For instance, well fields has a number of user inputs where ditches and diversions has less requirements. Most project modules are designed for developing planning level cost estimates. As such, detailed project components are either generalized or assumed because the user is not expected to know all project details at this level. In general, the modules are organized where high-level project inputs and outcomes are considered first. The user then works through more detailed components of the project, keeping high-level project goals in mind. So here's just an example of one of the project modules. I'm showing the ditches and diversions module. It's intended for diversion structures and irrigation ditches for agricultural use. Types of ditch and diversion projects could include ditch or canal construction, ditch or canal rehabilitation, and in-channel diversion structures. The most common type of ditch and diversion projects among the existing basin implementation plans involve rehabilitation or improvements to existing ditches through ditch relining. So the projects are reliant on several variables, including channel geometry, discharge through the diverting stream, and required ditch capacity. To help users develop their diversion structure cost, there's a list of existing diversion structure projects. Diverted quantity and approximate diversion structure cost is provided as a reference in the tool and in associated documentation. So in some cases, a ditch or diversion project may be one component of a larger water supply project. So it could be appropriate to use this module along with others, for example, stream and habitat or reservoirs and well fields. So from the project modules, costs are developed separately in the costing module. It brings together the information supplied and calculated from global inputs and whichever project modules were used to develop planning level cost estimates and an overall cost summary sheet. The costs are broken out into construction, project development, and annual costs. The construction costs are developed using the output from the project modules and applying cost curves. The cost curves are adjusted to account for current market conditions based on the year input by the user. Project development and annual costs are developed using percent markups and other inputs that can be adjusted by the user as needed. And then this just shows it's all summarized at the end in a clean summary sheet. It summarizes the capital costs and outlines the project development, annual, and normalized costs. So the cost estimating tool certainly doesn't replace developed or detailed cost estimates. It really serves two main functions. It provides a tool for basins to estimate and report planning level costs for proposed projects. It also allows CWCB to make like-for-like comparisons of proposed projects across the state. Roundtables may also use the tool for financial reporting of project cost estimates during the next round of basin implementation plans. The tool was developed with the best available data, was limited in some instances, so it's recommended that the tool be reviewed and updated on a regular basis. For example, whenever the water plan technical data sets are updated. As more cost data are available, the cost data that the tool relies upon can be expanded and the tool can be refined.
Great. Thanks, Becky. And again, feel free to pipe up with the chat feature if anybody has questions. I'm just going to wrap things up. This is Greg Johnson again with the Colorado Water Conservation Board, and really try to show how all of this is connected and where we're headed from here, what the next steps are. So I did want to remind people that this is the last of these webinars on the tech update. Again, the update itself is coming out in about a month, a little less than a month, on July 18th at our board meeting, the CWCB board meeting. We'll have a joint meeting with the Interbasin Compact Committee, and we'll be releasing at least the preliminary release of that study, and then we'll be publishing hard copies of the document later in the next couple months. I will add that we also have a data visualization project we're working on, so all of this will be published on the website, but stay tuned. In the next 6 to 9 months, we will have a much more interactive web experience that we'll have designed for you. We'll really have a lot of the data, a lot of the layers that you'll be able to turn off and on and really kind of dive into the tech update data a little bit better. So we have had these 5 webinars now. The previous 4 are up on the website. We have a page on the Colorado Water Plan website, which is linked from the main CWCB webpage. And so feel free to either get the presentation itself or go back and listen to the YouTube link for any of those things. So Matt had mentioned some of this earlier on, but this is certainly the first piece, setting the technical foundation for all of the water planning that we do, and we're really trying to clarify the message around all things water plan at the CWCB. So everything is tied together, 3 different phases, and we're really bringing this all under the umbrella of the Colorado Water Plan. So again, releasing the analysis technical update in July, and then pivoting to launch into updates of the local components, so of the basin implementation plans, followed shortly thereafter, wrapping that all up in the comprehensive update to the water plan proper, to the policy recommendations. So that excerpt you see there on the right is a table from Chapter 11 of the water plan that detailed the year that we were to initiate each of those different phases. So we have stayed true to that, and initiating what was called the statewide water supply initiative, which we're rebranding as Tech Update. We had initiated that in 2016. Now releasing that in 2019. We had kicked off the base implementation plans last year in 2018 with discussions with the roundtables, and actually started a implementation working group. So it was a subset of roundtable members. We just wrapped that up today, had the last version, the last session of that after starting that last December. And so got a lot of good feedback on how we're really going to be doing a lot of this work that will then kind of shape all the basin implementation plan updates. So again, we're really trying to clarify the message. Everything is an integral part of the water plan. So rebranding, everything that we're doing, and really helping people understand where we're going and why we're going there. So not just to do things for the sake of doing things. We're not just planning to plan, but to really try to add value to make sure that this is all moving things forward to help with water supply throughout the state. So we need better numbers to really do this, especially to help with funding. There's been a lot of discussion about the need for funding for various kinds of water projects, whether it's restoration efforts or infrastructure or whatever else. But we really need to get better data. So that is one of the most important things we're doing as we work with the Basin Roundtables is to update the project list. We call them the IPPs, the Identified Projects and Processes. So that will be the first order of business as soon as we get off the ground in the next 6 to 9 months, is really taking a hard look at the project data that we have. The costing tool that Becky just walked through, we're hoping will be, again, a value add. That tool, well, far from perfect, it does provide a subset of information that can really help inform some of those projects that may not have decent costing information. And then we're also looking at how we can tier projects moving forward. So to at least identify some rough prioritization to again really help with the funding conversation moving forward. To know what projects may really be rising to the top, what projects may be more conceptual, but still be important to pursue down the road. And so one of the things that we looked at with that implementation working group with the subset of Basin Roundtable members was a rough draft of what a project tier matrix might look like. And then ultimately something like this will be built into a refined database. Another big piece of this whole process is to get a central online database for all the projects. It's just to have everything in one place, which to date we have not had. So that we're excited to move that forward. And then we certainly need to keep the grassroots efforts with the roundtables moving right along. So that whole process has been evolving, since it started in 2006, 2007, and we want to make sure that again we keep making sure that there is a value add there. So the roundtables will be looking at their basin goals. Maybe some of those goals have changed, maybe they haven't, but there has been about a 50% turnover in roundtable membership since those first base implementation plans were created about 4 years ago now. So we'll also be looking at local gaps and opportunities. So using all of the technical information and the data from this tech update and trying to interpret what that means at the local level and what opportunities are even presented by that. And then finally integrating the new basin planning efforts that might be out there. So there's a lot of work that's been done since 2015, since the water plan and the basin plans were completed. So a lot of different studies, different local efforts, things like stream management plans have been a major one in a lot of different basins. So looking how those can be rolled up into the basin plan and how they help inform some of those other gaps and opportunities within the basin. And certainly the water plan was always intended to be a living document. There's the quote there on the right from the plan itself, that we never intended to just publish this plan in 2015 and then kind of move on, but that we would always be revisiting kind of what it means and how we can better use the information we have to help address our water issues in the state. So during this process, there will be some amount of concurrent effort. So we'll certainly start with the update to the base implementation plans, but then that will roll right into an update of the water plan proper, the water plan itself. So we'll be looking at what needs to be updated in the plan. There's a lot of good work in the plan itself that probably does not need to be updated. A lot of good information about how water moves around in the state, how we manage water in the state. But then there's a lot of things that do need to be updated. So a lot of taking a hard look at the metrics that we have. How are we tracking progress? What actions are completed or need to be added? So we'll be having a lot of those conversations with the roundtables as they get through their basin plan process, and how that will all inform the water plan itself, as well as good discussions with our board and with the Interbasin Compact Committee as well. So how we're planning to get there, this is the rough timeline. Let's just showing you the next couple of years of how we really intend for all of this to play out. So we are working on an RFP, a request for proposals, to hire contractors. We do have funding from the projects bill, our annual appropriation through the legislature, to fund this whole process. So we will be getting that RFP out in the next couple months, and looking to hire contractors throughout the remainder of this year, having them on board to hopefully dive in full bore starting January of 2020. Again, really focusing on updating the project so that the IPP lists work initially, and then moving into the deeper analysis and the update of the basin plan document itself. And then during 2020, 2021, again, to the schedule that I'd shown from that chapter 11 of the water plan, diving into updating the plan itself and planning to wrap that up by November of 2022. And finally, I wanted to remind people that we do have the statewide Basin Roundtable Summit. We're calling it the Colorado 9 Basin Roundtable, so the C9 Summit will be September 25th and 26th of this year. Registration is open. It's on our website, of course. I think there's a link from the Colorado Water Plan website. We will be hosting this at the Headwaters Center. That is a nice new facility up in Winter Park. So we're excited about that, and very much looking forward to a robust agenda for a day and a half up there. And that's all we've got for you today. But we are, again, happy to stay on the line. We can unmute folks, or you can unmute yourself, I believe, or use the chat feature if you've got any other questions about any of this stuff, whether it's the next steps or whether it's any of the tools or the insights that Brendan and Becky and Matt had presented.
Well, there's a question, will the PowerPoints be made available? And yes, definitely. This PowerPoint's already posted on the Water Plan website right now, but the actual webinar recording will also be posted by the end of the day. I did go ahead and mute everyone, so if you wanted to unmute yourself to ask a question, feel free.
And I would just add, for all these, we have penciled in an hour and a half, but we've been really trying to keep the presentations to an hour. We know everybody's busy, so we are happy to stay on the line, but we know everybody's got all sorts of good work to get done.
There's a question from Ryan. Any idea when the fuzzy visualization tool might be completed?
Good question, Ryan. We are working on that. I would like to think within the next 6 to 9 months. That was kind of the original time frame, was to have something up by the end of the calendar year. We're a little bit behind. We actually are closing up the RFP process on that right now, and trying to make the selection, and then go through contracting to get somebody on board. So yeah, ideally we would have something up by the end of the year, but it could very well go into the first quarter of next year. Well, thanks again to everyone for participating. And again, you always know where to find us, so please feel free to reach out with any questions or comments or advice or whatever you got. We're always happy to talk.
All right.